Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing sort of a wiring 101. So in my previous Hellcat Magnum video, I wired up the car, and a lot of people that watched the video were very afraid of wiring or very standoffish of doing it on their own projects, and they made that very vocal, and it was like 8 million people. So they were saying that it gave them nightmares, anxiety, stress. I mean, the list goes on, and wiring shouldn't be that stressful or difficult. It's very simple, and I feel like there's this kind of made-up fear in the automotive community that wiring is harder than it is. So most people take their cars to shops. The shop doesn't know how to wire a car. They do a very poor job, and then the person then has to troubleshoot that very shoddy wiring later on down the road, and they don't know what happened or where things go, and it just turns into this big nightmare. Or somebody tries to wire up their own vehicle and do an engine swap, but then they get lost or they don't keep track of things very well, and it turns into this nightmare where they don't know how to read wiring schematics and they don't know where anything goes, and then they try to take it to a shop and they're like, no, we don't want to touch this, which I understand completely. A shop getting a car that has a bunch of, a million wires exploded in it. What I want to show is a bunch of things that will really help you in wiring and getting things to work correctly and not have a bunch of gremlins at the end of the day. So when your project is done, you're not going to be chasing things like butt connectors or the twist ties from Home Depot, or even those heat shrink gallium connectors, which I don't know why people use those in their car, because gallium is very corrosive to aluminum, and enough of it will turn aluminum block into like dust. So I will start off with soldering. I always solder everything I do. If I don't crimp on new connections, if I'm doing a splice, I'm going to solder it, and I'm going to use adhesive lined heat shrink. First thing you're going to want to get is a set of wire strippers, and I'd recommend a set that has the end open like this, because it's a lot easier. Some of them have it on the inside, but then you have to move your hand every time you want to do it, and it just is a lot easier. And also get one that has like a little spring on it. Makes it a lot more convenient when you're doing a lot of wiring. So then you just really stick this in here, and I usually cut off about that much, and you don't want to go too small of a size, because then it'll start cutting off pieces of the wire, which if we go to the first one and do it, you'll still see some wire in there because it cut the wire, and that's not good, because then you have a smaller wire by just a little bit. Plus it adds a failure point if this gets moved back and forth or vibrates. If it is cut close enough, it could lose some strands over time, which could cause some amperage issues. It could work, and then if you pull too many amps through the wire, and then it could, overheat. You now have your wires stripped and ready to solder together, but there's a few different ways I've seen people put these together, and it's, there's only one real good way to get something like this connected. I've seen a lot of people try to put solder on each end, and I'll show that, and then you just kind of glue them together almost. And then there's the one where people just kind of, they twist them at the end like this, solder it, and then you have your wire like this, and then you can like fold it over. I don't like doing that either. The way I like to do it is, you can see the strands of wire, and you just kind of work them together so they're like intertwined. You can see it's kind of like bunched up right there, and then you just put your finger over it and you twist it, and it's nice and uniform. It's easy to get a piece of shrink tube over it. So the one thing you don't have to worry about when you connect the wiring like this, after you solder it, it's 100% bonded. You're also going to reduce any chances of a resistance here, because this is really nice connection. All the wire and strands, as long as you solder it correctly, are going to be joined together. pulling it apart, and I'm going to show that as well, is going to be very, very difficult. I'm going to put all the links in the description for everything, but I'm going to recommend you getting a Weller soldering iron, and you could adjust the temperature to what you need it to. So this works if you're going to solder stuff on circuit boards. And I like this because you can turn it up so you could do really quick solder joints and not have any cold joints. The other thing about having a nice soldering iron like this is it comes with a stand and a sponge, and you just keep this sponge wet and it cleans your tip off really nice, gets it ready to solder. So the first thing I do when I'm soldering is I make sure the tip's hot and ready to go. And then you want to start from the bottom and you heat the wire up. And once it's hot enough, you can pour the solder or push the solder into the copper, and you're not pushing the solder from the bottom up. What that does is it makes sure that the whole wire is completely encased in solder, and all the strands now have solder. As you can see, all the strands and all the way around the wire is soldered together. There isn't anything missed. There isn't just a dab and it just is on the top, and you cannot pull this apart. There's no pulling this solder joint right here apart. Tin up the two wires. I've seen a lot of people do it this way. You just add a little bit of solder like that. Do the same thing on this one. And I really do not like doing it this way. So you have solder on both of these. All you're really trying to do is, I've seen people glue them together like this. They're just like, it's ready to go. But then the issue with that is it takes a lot longer because there's not really a mechanical bond. So you have to wait, and then you have to hold it steady. But as you're holding it, you're gonna have this cold joint right here. So as you can see, that it's a cold joint, and you're also going to be really hard to pull this apart, which you're never going to be pulling on wire that hard. But the issue is most of the time people do this. This is a good one because I could pull it apart. So what I've seen a lot is people just have the wire too short and they'll just dab on the end, which will give you an issue with resistance. And then it pops apart like so. So it's not a really good joint. And the other one also isn't a good joint, but it has a lot more surface area. Most likely you're not going to have any issues with a change in resistance. But this one on just the edge is a big issue with resistance and it coming apart and having later on failures if anything gets snagged, or you put a wiring harness or you pull something, it might just pull that joint off, and then you'll be like, well, I soldered everything, why isn't my wiring harness working? What I'm not going to show you is I'm not going to do this joint right here and solder it together, because this also is a pretty good mechanical bond. The only issue with it is when you heat shrink it, it's going to always have this 90-degree bend, and that's a failure point over time. So we're not going to do that, but that is something I've seen. And also the twist ties that are used on those, or the butt connectors, those are really easy to pull apart. Let's say we need to do a branch for powers, grounds, illumination circuit, whatever you're going to be doing, a 5-volt reference on an engine wiring harness. What I always do for branches is I twist the two together, and if I have heat shrink that I'm going to be putting on it, which you always do, you're going to put it on this side and slide it down, and it'll hold these two wires together, which is very important. And then you're going to grab your other wire that's supplying or going or whatever it's doing, and you're just going to push it in like the first one as far as you can. You're just kind of intertwining it together, and then you want to just push them together, and as you can see, it has a nice mechanical, pretty much a mechanical bond, because everything is so tight together, and it's almost like braiding it together, but not really. I'm going to solder this together the same way I did the first joint, or the first good joint. You're just going to go like this, let some go through, and then you're going to push through the top down. And as you can see, we have solder just like the first joint all the way through, and it's a nice shiny tin, unlike this right here, which is a cold joint. You can see it's less shiny. It's more kind of a matte finish. Then you can look at it under a magnifying glass and you can see how nice and soldered it is together. It's all the way back here on each edge, and that's not going to come apart. You're not going to have any issues throughout the life of the wiring harness. The same thing on the first joint, which is right here. You can see how nice and uniform that is compared to this cold joint right here. You can see how matte it is, how the wires are all kind of frayed looking on the end where it came apart. This joint may last a little bit, but it's eventually going to fail. So that's something to be very wary of, is trying to kind of just tack stuff together when you're soldering it. Because if you do, most likely you're going to end up having something that fails eventually. So the next thing I want to talk about is heat shrink tube. I would recommend using this all the time, especially adhesive lined. If you're doing anything automotive related, it doesn't matter if it's on the interior, exterior, adhesive lined is going to give you that nice barrier from the wire sheathing to the bare copper and tin, because if any water ingress gets in here, it's going to start corrosion, and then you'll have issues later on down the road with this adhesive line. And I've seen a lot of people just use electrical tape, and then they have issues as well. Plus this adds an extra layer of bonding, so then you're not going to have to worry about just the solder joint alone, it relying on that. Like I said before, I like to have the adhesive lined shrink tube on the 2 strands of the branch instead of having it on the 1, because most of the time if it's going to go over the 2, it's going to go over the solder. So if it doesn't fit over these wires that's on the branch, the 2 wires, 3 wires, 4 wires, it's probably not going to go over this joint, and then you're going to have to either cut it and put another piece of adhesive lined shrink tube, or most people are like, oh, it doesn't fit, so I'm just going to do electrical tape. So then you just come over here and you make sure you want to get it as centered as you can. And I always try to do like 1/8 to 1/4 inch of overlap, just so it has a little bit more adhesive to keep all that, to keep all the elements out. So then you just use a heat gun and it goes really quick. So now you can see right there the adhesive squeezing in between the wires in the joint, so there isn't going to be any issues of contamination later on, water, anything being corroded in this solder joint. So then you have some wires that are connected that you don't have to worry about failing over time as you drive your car, especially 10-20 years. This joint should last the life of the car, so you shouldn't have to constantly be fixing gremlins or anything like that. I'm going to wrap my fingers around both of these and try to pull this apart. And it broke the wire before it broke the joint. That's how strong this joint is. So you're not going to have to ever worry about this failing. The next most important thing to do when you're wiring, let's say you're doing an engine swap, you're splicing in a harness, you're making it work, and let's say you're doing a K24, you're making it work in a 240SX, but you have to splice a bunch of wires and you want to keep track of everything. The best way I've found to do this is this masking tape right here. So if you can't you know, a lot of the Dodges and most of the JDM cars, wiring harnesses for the engines, etc., are really easy to keep track of because they use all the same color wire and it's all consistent. The newer vehicles like the Dodges, they will have this white black, or I guess white black's not very good to go by, but let's say this white orange. But after a plug, it will be more of like a white, like maybe a white pink or a white red. It really isn't consistent because for some reason the coloring on the wire when they screen print these, I guess that's how they do them, is they screen print them, is inconsistent. I'm guessing what happens is as they print it, they have just like a, you know, vat of paint, and as it goes, it kind of changes the color just a little bit. But it's very difficult when you have 50 of the similar, you know, the same similar color wires, same size, and you know, you have a white red, a white orange, a white pink, you know, a white tan. You'd be surprised at how close the colors look when you're looking at all the same ones. So then what you're going to do is you just, you know, you have one wire here that you cut, you have this other wire over here that you cut, and you're going to get 2 pieces of tape. I mean, this is very simple stuff. And you just wrap the tape around it, right over itself. Really easy, really simple. And then you could write whatever message you want. You can write, you know, let's say this is the IAT, intake air temp, IAT, to, and it's going to the ECU, and it's from the sensor. And you write the same thing on this one, and it could be IAT to ECU. So you know these 2 wires go together. But you could also do it a lot simpler than that. I recommend writing yourself a note, because if you just do, when I first started doing wiring harnesses, I would just do like, this wire is wire number 1, and then this wire is wire number 1. But the issue with that is when you start getting to branches, you have, let's say you have like 15 of these white oranges that go to each other. So then you could write yourself messages, IAT to ECU, and then you know that this all goes to the same, you know, this all goes to the same pin. This all has to be connected together. Let's say you have 1 wire going in, and then you have 4 wires for the branch right here. These represent the 4 wires. So you can do 2 tags, and they could be, let's say it's still IAT to ECU, but then you can put 5. So you know there's 5 wires. There's 4 here and 1 here that are connected together. Or you could do, let's say you just want to do a number. You could say that they're both 1s, and then there's 5 of those wires connected. But then it gets really confusing because you don't really know where those wires actually go. And then it's just easier to write yourself a message like this, and you have 2 sides to write a message on, so it's more than enough. You can get finer point Sharpies as well if you need to, but it makes it a lot easier to figure out where stuff goes, especially if you're going to be doing this over, let's say, a month, 2 months. It's not something, you know, it's a project you work on every weekend. You don't have, you know, it's not a full-time gig where, you know, you're doing a YouTube channel and you have, that's all you're doing for a month straight. Even doing the Hellcat Magnum for a month straight, all the wiring, I was still writing myself messages where stuff went. So I knew if I forgot where that wire went, I would still be able to get it to its original home, so everything was going to work correctly. So I definitely, this is probably the most important part. Besides soldering a joint correctly, this is probably the most important part, to know when you're doing a wiring harness or trying to tuck a wiring harness, custom wiring harness, whatever it may be. This helps out tremendously. Even, you know, if you're doing it in a day, I mean, it's always going to, you know, if you lose something, you could run into something doesn't work, your IAT sensor doesn't work, a lot of stuff uses 5-volt references. This doesn't have a 5-volt reference, so my map sensor is not working. What's going on? This helps you mitigate that. Another really important thing to know when doing a wiring harness is how to depin connectors. This is probably another really important thing to know, especially if you're doing custom engine harnesses, you're wiring up a car, you're going to add something, because every time I do a wiring harness, I always depin everything. It makes it a lot easier. I've seen a lot of people, they will cut off 3 inches back here of this wire, then they'll solder it together, then you have a million solder joints when you could have just depinned this injector connector and not had to worry about it. Or if you're adding a different connector for injectors, you have some different injectors, bigger ones, they come with a different plug. They give you pins for a reason. This is an injector connector, and the one thing about everything in the world is if you can put it together, you can take it apart, and all you have to do, as you can see right here, there's a little slot. You get a flathead, stick it in there, pop it up, then you go from the side, and you get her all the way up, pull it out, nothing broke. You can see the pins right there. This kind of connector, it's really simple because you can just use a needle for like sewing. I think these are for like when you make clothes, you pin a bunch of stuff together. I'm not exactly sure, but you just use these. They have a bunch of different style depinning tools. This really works good. For some connectors, you're going to need it because they're really small holes. You might not be able to see it, but there's these 2 prongs in here. One right here and one right here, one for each wire. And you just literally pop it up, pull it out, pop it up, and pull it out. So then you have your depinned wires. They have the seal still on them, so you don't have to worry about adding seals or soldering anything. You can literally depin these most of the time and use them in your new injector connectors. So I would really recommend learning how to depin, because it's a very useful tool if you're going to do anything with wiring. There's a bunch of different connectors, and as you can see, this one's different from the injector connector, and there's always different ways they have the pins locked in. So you always have to pull the lock out like we did on the injector. This one, as you can see right here, it just pops up like so. And you don't want to pop it all the way up, because if you go any further, we'll do this one. If you go too much further, it'll break. I don't really want to break this one because it's a good connector, but you have to do both sides. Just unclip those tabs, and to lock them back in, you just have to click the tabs back in. So just push your screwdriver through to unclip them. And then this one is a little bit different, because unlike the other one where you can see the pin, this little tiny square hole right there is where you need to put or insert your tool. And I'll put a link in the description for all those little pin tools, and it will unclip this pin and I can pull it out. But before I do that, I have to make it so I can actually get to it. So I have to pull this part of the connector apart, and these are pretty easy. I usually just go like this, and you can just come underneath it. And now that this covers off, I can actually get to the wire to grab it. Like I said before, you're going to need a set of these tools right here, or these pin removal tools or depressors, whatever you want to call them. And as you can see, this is the right size, and it goes directly in there. It's a really thin one, so it's going to go down. And all it's going to do is, as you can see, it's just going to press the pin, and it comes right out. What you're going to have to do is learn how to use this tool, because it's kind of a technique. You have to be able to, as you can see right here, you can kind of see from the side, what the tool's doing is it's going in, you can see the edge right there, and it's pressing the top of that pin down. And that's all you're doing, is depressing this right here. All this tool's doing is pressing on this little grommet to be able to pull it out of this housing. So I would recommend getting some connectors or wiring harness that you're going to work with, or spares from the junkyard, and then get the tools that you need. You're probably not going to need this for older JDM stuff, but the newer vehicles, Dodge, Chevy, Toyota, all the newer connectors have all these little tiny intricate pins, and they have really crazy ways that they hold them in. I can't show you all of them because there's just so many different styles. I mean, here's a different style right here. This one has a larger one. It uses, looks like this one right here. Yep. So it uses that one right there. But you can also get to it on the back side right there to depress it, as you can see right there. So it just depends on the connector. There's just so many different. That's it for the connectors. They're really simple once you learn how to do them. They all come apart, but some of them have really crazy ways that they lock the pins in, especially ABS pump modules. They have sometimes things that you have to unclip and unlatch, and it just really gets kind of intricate if you don't know what you're looking for, but now you should know what you're trying to find. It's the things that hold the pins in. Some of them pop off, some of them unclip like this, some of them slide like a lock. So now what I'm going to talk about is probably another important or very important thing you're going to have to know when working with wiring systems, if you're trying to troubleshoot something or if you're trying to tuck a harness, rewire, anything. So this is a wiring schematic, and there's quite a few different things you need to know, and it really could help you out if you're trying to troubleshoot something. If you've never seen this before, this isn't the full thing. Most of the time these are in color. They all have labels for what color the wire is supposed to be, as we can see right here. So right here, tan, gray, gray, white, brown, black, blue, pink, green, yellow, yellow, violet. And then once there's some like more intricate colors, they start abbreviating them weird. So on some of the older, not as much on the newer wiring harness diagrams, but blue and black on some of the JDM ones are very confusing. So you have to really pay attention to that. But most of the newer stuff doesn't really, it really points it out. This is blue, this is black. I mean, it's, on the JDM ones, I think on some of the older 240Z ones, they're just BL, and then they're just BL, but it's blue. So it just kind of confusing if you don't know what you're looking for. Another thing is you can see this right here, this solid line. So this is showing a complete component. As you can see, this is the security gateway. This is the whole module. All these pins right here, or everything going to it, is complete. There isn't anything missing off of this. And that's something you have to know, because most of the time, these will have a dotted line like this down here. So as you can see, this right here is a dotted line for the radio. And that is not a complete, since this is the CAN bus wiring circuit, this is not a complete view of the component. So this isn't showing any of the powers, any of the grounds, any of that stuff. All it's showing is the CAN. It's not showing any of the stuff from the RF module, etc. So if you see a dotted line like this on the newer diagrams, most likely on the JDM ones or the older vehicles, you're not going to see any of this, because it shows you a full schematic, because there isn't so much intricate stuff like CAN bus and RF module and theft deterrent and all this other stuff that they have on the newer stuff. So I just really pay attention. If you're seeing this and you're trying to wire a wiring harness from scratch off a wiring diagram, you're going to have to know that this thing is not the whole module. Not every wire is in this diagram. So another thing is right here is a splice, but on the older vehicles and the JDM cars, this splice would actually be the complete system. This splice is not the complete splice. So as you can see, it says SP203, that means splice 203, and it tells you right center of dash and instrument panel harness. It's really nice that it tells you where it is, but there's multiple wires going to this splice. So that means if you print out all the diagrams, you'll find another, you'll have another diagram. Probably, I'm not sure what it's going to be because I can't remember, but you'll have another wire that comes into this, maybe 5 wires, who knows. But you have to really pay attention to these splices, because if you're doing something from scratch and you don't have all the wires connected to the system, it's not going to work correctly. So that's a really good tip right there. Also, if you see this dot on a line, so you can see all these lines right here are crossing, but there's no dot. That if there's no dot, it means it's just bypassing the wires. It's not connected. Right here is a very good example of a wire coming in and it connecting. So this little dot right here means the wire is connected, which is a really good thing to know, because if you just think, oh, maybe it's just, I don't know what people think, but sometimes they don't realize that this is a connected wire to the circuit, even though it says orange, blue there, orange, blue there. Sometimes on Dodges though, they will change the color. So it'll be a splice and one will be like an orange blue and one will be like a red or a light orange or something crazy like that. So then you see this dotted line right here. That means this continues on to all these other components and it still splices. This is all the stuff that I printed out for the charger when I was wiring it, because I had to do, we have the Durango wiring, we have the Charger Hellcat wiring. It just turns into this big snowball. And if you don't know what you're looking at, and I think I've given you a pretty good idea, because all of these are labeled. As you can see, this is all the headliner harness, or no, this is the driver power seat circuit. So it shows, the varistor for the seat. It shows you all the components of the seat on the driver's side, and then it shows all these splices. Really convenient if you know what you're looking for, because then that goes over to the seat switch, and then you know that this whole thing is all in the underneath of the seat, and then there's just the power and a ground coming in. As you can see right here, here's the power coming from the fuse box, which is a dotted line. It's incomplete component because it's a whole fuse box. And then the ground right here, it shows that it's a dotted line because there's multiple grounds connected to that one point right there. So it's just a lot to kind of learn, and it's a lot to go through, but as long as you know what you're kind of looking for, which I hopefully have really showed you, you'll be able to figure all this stuff out, be able to wire up a car. So hopefully I showed you some very good basics of wiring. Hopefully you know now how to properly connect some wires together and solder, depin a connector, kind of read a wiring schematic. There's a bunch of different stuff that you really have to know. Keeping track of your wiring is probably the biggest thing, and especially when you're doing a whole car like I did on the Hellcat Magnum, you have to keep all those systems in order. And then I was adding stuff from the Durango, stuff from the Challenger, stuff from the Charger, and it just was a bunch of just wiring and making sure everything was gonna connect in the correct spot and work well together and actually have powers, grounds. And the biggest thing is, if you have a power and you have a ground, most likely it's one or the other if you have a module that's not working. So I would always check your powers and your grounds. I'll put a link in the description for a power probe. I have one of those. They're a very good tool because it'll tell you if it has a power, if it has a ground, and it's very convenient. It helps you out diagnosing easy wiring issues. If you're trying to install speakers or an amp, I mean, it's really, really useful. So I'm going to put a link in the description for all of those products, and hopefully this video helped whoever watches it. If you like these videos, make sure to click that subscribe button, throw a thumbs up, throw a comment below. As always, see you guys next time.